So it's my great pleasure to present to you for to certificate that list.
Good morning. So I have several interactive activities for us to do together and some things for discussion. But I think it's boring just to listen to one person talk forever. So if you have questions at any time, feel free to ask them. I think we all get more out of any conversation if there are multiple participants. So briefly, what I'm going to cover today is what unconscious bias is, how it influences our behavior, how it affects student success, give you some strategies and techniques for how you can identify what your own biases might be and how you can minimize the impact of those biases. And I'm going to wrap up with some strategies about good communication tips and things that you can use to help minimize the ability of creating misunderstandings when you're having conversations. So first, what is unconscious bias? Unconscious bias, which is also known as implicit bias, refers to attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, our decisions, and that's happening on an unconscious level, meaning that we're not aware of those biases that we hold. They can include things that are both favorable assumptions and unfavorable assumptions. And the opposite of that then would be explicit biases, which are things, your consciously held beliefs, choices, attitudes, etc. So how do these biases develop? Every day that we are taking in millions of pieces of information from all sources around us, and our brain has to process that information and decide what it's going to do with it. So our own background, our education, our family, our friends, the media and news that we consume or just are exposed to when you're sitting at the doctor's office or some other place and there happens to be something on TV, your social experiences, and the repeated exposure to stereotypical associations becomes logged in our long-term memory. So we're making those recorded actions and they're staying in our memory. When we encounter additional situations that feel the same, we're gonna have the same kind of reaction to them. So, full disclosure, I am not a neuroscientist. If any of you happen to also be a neuroscientist, this is going to be a very simplistic explanation of how this kind of works in our brain. So our neocortex is where your higher level executive functioning and thinking, planning, decision making occurs, and that's the conscious part of your brain. You're aware of it, you're making choices, you're making decisions, you're thinking through processes. There in the middle of our brain, that's really our emotional center, where our hormones and our emotional reactions and our response to stress and fear and danger, where those things live. And in particular, the amygdala is the primary section of the brain that's really responsible for our fight, flight, freeze, or faint response to serious stress or danger. And so another kind of illustration of that is, again, the outside, the conscious part of our brain is where we're doing all of our higher level order thinking. That internal unconscious part is where all of our automatic body processes are occurring, where our emotional responses, those things that happen, but we're not consciously aware that they're occurring. So now I'm going to ask you guys to do something. I'm going to explain what we're going to do, and then I'm going to tell you when to actually do it. So we're going to shut our eyes, and then I'm going to ask you to take your arm and touch the tip of your nose. So everyone, please, now shut your eyes. I see people touching noses without eyes closed. While you're doing it, really think about the process of raising your arm to your nose. So most people are able to easily find their nose in that exercise, even though you can't see it, because we have tacit knowledge about where the tip of our nose is on our face.
Big noses.
That could be true too. And so usually we don't spend concentrated energy on doing those types of actions. Often with this type of exercise, you would ask the participants to write out a description of what they did. I elected not to do that today just for the sake of time. And normally what somebody might write is, I picked up my arm, I raised it towards my face, and I touched my nose. But the physiological mechanisms that are actually occurring in our body to make that action happen are much more complicated than that, and will require at least me, if not most of us, to do some pretty substantial research, unless we are a biologist and study human physiology, to really accurately reflect in words what that process requires. How many of you used your dominant hand? Most people generally do. Because that is part of the automatic assumption. You didn't think about it, you picked up your hand to do it. Now, I keep doing it with my non-dominant hand because when I've done this before, for whatever reason, I now have the habit of using my left arm to do it. For an activity like this, you're not really missing out on the opportunity to have that experience with your non-dominant hand, for instance. You're not really missing that much. But if you think about all of the behaviors that occur automatically and unconsciously, we are missing opportunities to create new knowledge because we don't stop and pause and think, hey, what it might be like from a different perspective. I've got a couple more things for you. So next, I'm going to show you an image, and I want you to be loud. Just say what you see first. Anybody?
Go faces.
Anybody see both?
Yes.
So this is an optical illusion. You've got kind of a chalice, or it could be bell, a vase, some kind of shape like that. And then you also have two faces. Some people see the dominant color first and see the part in the middle. Some people are more visually recognize human-like expressions and see the faces first. And most people are able to see both, sometimes at the same time, or some at least they see the one and then they see the other. So we're gonna watch, we're not gonna watch this for 2 entire minutes. But once it starts, I want you to, and I'm gonna just keep hitting that, to think about which way is the dancer moving? What do you see? Clockwise. Anybody see counterclockwise? Anybody see both? Yeah, and here's the solution of that. For any of you who can't see both, it does take kind of focused attention if that's not where your eye is automatically drawn, but you notice which leg you focus on makes the difference on which way you see the dancer spinning. And I really just show both of these as an illustration of the exact same stimulus. We all have different perceptions to that. And it doesn't just happen with, silly little optical illusions. It happens with everything, in exchange with a student, in exchange with a colleague. Same exact conversation, 2 totally different perceptions about what occurred. Anybody familiar with Project Implicit? Yes, no, maybe? I got nothing. Okay. So Project Implicit started in like 1995 from the Harvard University and several other universities. And what they did was create a series of implicit association tests that were designed to measure our unconscious bias. And so how these tests work is they gauge our unconscious bias by measuring your speed between making associations between a positive or negative attribute and a particular class of people, whether it's race, age, sex, etc. They have an extensive amount of tests. And this picture on the right is kind of what it looks like. So you will get a prompt that says African American, and it'll have a list of good attributes, like good, creative, 3 or 4 positive attributes. And then you'll get European American, both associated with the face, and a list of negative attributes. attributes. And then the test will start. And it will flash the face and the word, and you have to react to which is correct with the list that they provided. So it will go through one round, and then it will switch. The negative attributes will then be assigned to the African American, and the positive attributes would then be assigned to the European American. And it goes through several rounds like that. And what they're doing is measuring that reaction time between how quickly you're able to make those associations. The last time I looked, it said over 6 million people have participated in these various tests since 1995. And so they have a lot of data and research that they put out publicly for people to use. So of their assessments, at least 75% of test takers show an implicit bias favoring the young, the rich, and the white. That means they're making faster reaction times to associating positive attributes to those particular groups. The fact that someone has a conscious desire not to be biased does not influence that. So the fact that you consciously don't want to treat people unfairly does not influence the unconscious part of your brain that's making these associations. Depending upon what group status is, whether you belong to a member of an underrepresented group or you're part of a more majority group, both sets of groups tend to have a preference for the majority group over their own in-group. And their research theorizes that the higher levels of bias that you have, the more likely it is that you would actually act on those things in a real life situation or encounter. So in my research, one article said there are over 105 types of bias. I am not going to read you definitions of 100 type things, but I'm going to talk about some of them that I think occur a lot, particularly in hiring, also in the classroom with students, pretty common effects on whenever we're evaluating or making assessments of another person's work, material, worth, etc. So conformity bias is the tendency to conform to group peer pressure. So you're in a departmental meeting, kind of like now, and one person makes a suggestion, no one else says anything. That person's really excited about it. We as human beings socially want to belong in the group. You're more likely to be like, yeah, that's a good suggestion. Even if you were thinking, well, maybe I don't really want to do that, but nobody else is saying anything, so maybe it must be a good suggestion. Let's go with that idea. Beauty bias is the tendency for people to think that the more attractive someone is, the more likely they are to be successful. And just because I think it's interesting, apparently being a tall male, makes it much more likely for you to be a corporate CEO, a president, or a high-level military officer. And at least in one study, possibly earn more money if you're over 6 feet tall. And those are at a disproportionate.
47, 89.
It's not much, but you know, maybe it's by inch of height over 6 feet. Oops. Oh, that did go back where I wanted it to go. Okay, so contrast effect is magnifying or diminishing your perception of something based on previous exposure. So a really good example of this is if you were reviewing resumes or student admission applications. You read one, it's really, really good. The next one you read, you're going to be judging it against the one that was really good. You read one that's really bad, and the next one you read is okay, but it's significantly better than the bad one, so you're gonna be more favorable of that particular evaluation. Attribution bias is systematic errors that we make when people evaluate and try to find reasons for their own behaviors and the behaviors of others. So when you do something really well and you succeed, it's because of your merit and talent. But when you don't do as well at something, there's some external factor that prevented you from being fully successful. And the reverse is true for other people. When other people do well, they're lucky. But when other people don't do as well, it's because of their personality or their own behavior. And confirmation bias is the tendency for people to seek information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs about them. If we think it's there, we're going to be proved right. So now I'm going to play another video for you. What you're going to do is count the basketball passes of the players in the white shirts. So, how many people saw the gorilla? I heard some laughing.
But when I did this test by myself, first time, I didn't see.
So, people who watched this, at least the first time, missed the gorilla.
It's the gorilla completely.
If you knew about it, you probably saw it. Did anyone notice that the curtain changed colors? Or that a player wearing a black shirt left the scene?
Oh my God. So amazing. You see it?
And that really is the point, selective attention. You are so focused on one thing, you miss everything else that might be available to you. And selective attention really is what contributes to confirmation bias. You're looking for something, you're going to find it, and you're going to miss everything else that is available. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the impacts of unconscious bias on students. Anybody familiar with the Pygmalion effect? No? Okay. Very, very briefly. It's the concept that expectations influence behavior. So if you have high expectations for someone, they're most likely going to conform to those expectations. If you have low expectations for someone, they're most likely going to conform to those expectations. So in the K through 12 system, high school students who had a teacher with higher expectations were 3 times more likely to graduate from college than students who had teachers who had lower expectations of them. Secondary education teachers had lower expectations of students of color and students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And college preparation programs and other factors that support higher expectations are significant predictors of college graduates. So if you're starting in K through 12 and your educational experience is your teacher doesn't expect very much of you, so unless you're particularly motivated and are driven by factors completely outside of that, you're likely to not perform as well. Then you're not going to have the same access to college preparatory type programs, and you're just further increasing, the achievement gap between students based on unconscious bias. Not that there has never been a teacher who was consciously biased, because that happens as well, but for the most part, the teachers want all of their students to exceed. They consciously have that desire for their students to exceed, but the effects of their behavior and how they're treating students and the access students are getting is different. This also relates in K through 12 to disproportionate discipline. So African American students, particularly African American boys, are much more significantly disciplined for the exact same offenses than their white peers. And that includes things such as expulsion and removal from schools. The large majority of these discipline type issues are disruptive behavior. which is something that I know you're familiar with here in the university environment as well. But what's disruptive behavior? That's very subjective. I could do one thing, somebody else could do the same thing. You're going to see it one way, they're going to see it another way, and we're not going to view those situations the same based on our own worldviews, conscious views, and our own unconscious associations that we've built up throughout time. Being removed from school for all of these expulsions further decreases their educational access and their ability to continue on to college. So moving into kind of the higher ed arena. So this is a study where prospective students emailed professors asking about programs, asking for advice, asking for assistance. White men received responses significantly more times than any other groups. Asian students in particular experienced the most bias. The gender or racial identity of the faculty members did not change these results. And the highest rates of bias occurred in private schools of natural science and business. And the higher the faculty salary, the higher the bias. So the research suggests that unconscious bias shapes student and instructor interactions, but also student and student interactions. It has influences on students' course performance and desire to be part of the field. So if a female student, for instance, takes an introductory math course, and the teacher has an unconscious bias that girls are not good at math, has low expectations for that student, the student may not perform as well as they would have normally, and then they give up. And we know that that's a thing. That female losing students, particularly in math, but in other fields, happens in K through 12. I can give you my own story. I took 4 years of math in high school, 4 years of science in high school, 4 years of everything beyond what was required. I went to college. Oh, I don't have to take math other than some random, I don't even know what kind of math class it was. That's the class I took. I never took math again. And I no longer remember how to do really basic things like fractions. That's, it happens. Without that kind of expectation and pressure, I'm like, oh, I could do other things. The same thing with harder sciences. That wasn't really the same choice because I was okay at math, but I wasn't great at math. I was pretty good at biology and human physiology, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I took my one science course, which was astronomy. Very fun. The professor was kind of crazy and threw like nitrogen around the room. And then I never took another one. So, it happens for both completely innocuous reasons, and it also happens for there is no support for women in STEM-related fields, and they fall out before they even have the opportunity to experience in college. It also influences instructors' nonverbal behaviors towards students, and it influences male students underestimating the academic performance of their female colleagues. And those dynamics can affect the female students' perceptions of their own abilities and desire to be feeling belonged in the discipline, and negative student-on-student climate affects absenteeism. I'm not going to come to class because when I come to class, those students are mean to me, or they don't like me, or they don't talk to me, or they don't include me in groups or participation. In class, instructors call on male students more frequently than female students. They're more likely to use male students' names when addressing them, and then attribute ideas and discussion points back to the male students. They're more likely to ask male students abstract questions and female students factual questions. And they're less likely to elaborate on points made by female students. For college students, undergraduate students tend to speak more, blurt out, not raise their hand. Women are more uninterrupted when they're speaking. They speak less often, they speak softer, and they tend to hedge things. I might be wrong, but in the lab, so faculty evaluated male and female applicants for a lab manager position These were identical applications. The only difference was a female sounding name or a male sounding name. Male and female faculty equally ranked. The male sounding name applicants higher, and even offered higher salaries. Identical credentials. The only difference is the name. Okay. So before we move on to how that bias kind of continues all throughout the rest of education, I wanted to bring up a recent event. Anyone read Inside Higher Ed? So this article came up in November. A professor at UT San Antonio called the police to escort an African American student out of the class for supposedly putting her feet up on the chair. Another student posted a video of the incident. It went viral. The president releases a statement, the university conducts an investigation, and they say that the student, another professor would be teaching the course for the remainder of the semester, and that the professor would come back in the spring after taking some class management training. Very small bit of information. We're gonna watch the video. It's really short, and it doesn't show anything particularly adverse, but I want to illustrate to you what the class looks like, because that's primarily what you're gonna be able to see. Oh, I should just look at my screen. I know that one. It's a tiny bit copy. And that's pretty much it. She gets up and walks out. So what are your thoughts about this? Just based on what we know here. All we know is supposedly that exchange happened because she had put her feet up on the chair. And what I wanted you to see is a lecture hall of, I'm not sure how, if you're teaching, you could pay attention to the fact that someone has their feet on the chair in front of them in that auditorium style seating. Anyone have any thoughts about this?
It's impossible to tell anything.
But
I
just,
can't tell anything, but one of the things that's interesting to me is the students do not seem particularly perturbed by what's going on. And so, you know, I have no idea what went on.
but based on just what is reported to have gone on, is that a proportionate thing to do for, if that was the case, the student put her feet on the chair in front of her to call the police to escort them out of class? Doesn't that seem odd, like an odd thing to do?
Well, I mean, I would ask why the police would have acted upon that.
Good question. Yeah, so we don't know much about base, and the video clip really doesn't show anything because they didn't start recording until the police actually arrived. So an article came out a couple days after this with a little more information. Supposedly, this student had an idiosyncratic preference for civility in the classroom, and one of her issues of civility was, we don't put proper feet up on the chairs in front of us. And the students in the class reported that she stopped class frequently to tell students, not the student who was escorted out of class, but multiple students in the class, to take their feet off the chairs. One particular class, this particular student had her feet propped on the chair. The professor asked her to take them down. She complied. The class went on. Afterwards, she had a conversation with a colleague who supposedly told her, next time that happens, call the police. The professor went home sent the student an email that said, don't report to the next class until we have a time to meet to discuss your behavior. When next class comes, the student shows up. The professor is angry. Why are you here? You need to leave now. The student's like, what are you talking about? The professor shows her the email. She sent the email to the wrong student. So instead of letting it go, she continued to be angry and insist that the student leave the class. The student's like, no, I need this class, and goes and sits down. The professor calls the police. She gets escorted out of the class. So the institutional investigation did not find that race was a factor in motivating that. They did find that it was an academic management issue. They required the professor to do some training. In a statement released by the student, she said that when she was repeatedly asked by the investigators whether she viewed that as racism, she said no. The professor did apologize to the student. Oh, excuse me, I skipped a part. She said no, but it did confirm to her that that professor had struggled with misidentifying her the entire semester. The professor did apologize to her, and she apologized to the professor if any of her behavior appeared to be disrespectful, disruptive, uncivil, etc. The student just wanted to move on. But I bring this up at least in part to say, just because the student was asked repeatedly whether she viewed it as racism, she may not be willing to tell you that. If you experience disproportionate reactions to everyday innocuous encounters your entire life, you may not always want to talk about that. You may want to move on. You may want to make your own assessments and choices. And there is such a thing as stereotype threat. The threat that stereotypes are going to be portrayed on you, and you are going to be judged for those stereotypical behaviors. Even if she didn't view it as racism, I would add the fact that she kept misidentifying her the entire semester is in and of itself an unconscious bias. It was a large class. She was not the only black student in the class, but she couldn't tell the few black students who were in the class apart from each other. So, update, January, there's another article. This professor came back to start her class and was promptly suspended. Again, the university declines to comment this time, but there's an article online saying that other faculty members complained because her syllabus now included specifically warning students against placing your legs or feet on the classroom furniture, reclining class, or other disrespectful behavior.
The one thing commendable about this professor is her insistence on civility in class. So I also personally don't like when people have their feet crossed and are eating while you're lecturing. So why isn't that part of the broader discussion?
I think it can be. I don't think there's anything wrong in particular with the professor having that as one of her classroom rules. I think, to me, where it really kind of runs afoul of what's reasonable is all semester long, she stopped class to tell multiple students who were not following this rule to put their feet down. This student does it once. She decides to tell the student not to come back to class, but she actually didn't tell that student. She sent it to another student, and when the student showed up to class, she called the police and asked her to leave. That's not civility.
I understand.
Yeah.
I
And
think it ought to be part of the broader culture.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's where most of this type of training on preventing harassment and discrimination, ultimately the best way to prevent those things is for us to have a culture and an environment where congeniality is one thing. It's nice if we're nice to each other, but that's kind of optional. We have to be collegial with each other. We have to be able to respect each other's opinions, have disagreements, and do that in a respectful manner. We don't have to agree all the time and be, oh, super nice and never talk about anything serious. We're supposed to talk about serious things. But we need to be able to do that in a way that we're civil. I can listen to what your perspective is, wait my turn, then ask you my questions, and you wait your turn, and we go back and forth. That's a dialogue. That's the purpose of education, at least in my opinion. But I think that's a good point.
Look at the way I sit it. This is how I always sit. And I have people who tell me that I probably shouldn't do that, but, my wife. But I think that if you're in a learning environment, people need to be comfortable in a learning environment. And I don't do this if there's somebody like right in front of me and I'm putting my leg on their shoulder, right? I respect people's space. But comfort in a learning environment, and different people are comfortable in different ways. That room was banked in a funny way. I would think it would be quite hard to sit in that room and be comfortable.
I think so too.
Yeah, I mean, I have an issue with phones. I hate when I'm teaching and I look at people just typing on their phone, you know, and sometimes I say something and sometimes I let it go, but it bugs me. And, you know, we all have these things, and I mean, the other thing I was going to say is I make a huge effort to learn everybody's name. So even when I'm teaching Cal 3 and I'm 75 students, I try to learn everybody's name. But so right now I'm teaching a class that's got 45 students in it. And there are two, and they're white guys. They sit in the far back. And even up to last week, I was mixing up their name. And I was trying to figure out, why do I have such a hard time? They don't look that alike. They always sit together. And I know one is Ben and one is Chance, but I don't know who's who. You know, and I mean, we sort of made a joke about it. And they told me, you know, I said, are you Ben or Chance? Because one of them came to the board to do something. And he told me the wrong name as a joke. And so afterwards, they admitted when I was handing the homework back, they were fooling me. You know, but that's not a bias thing.
No.
It's hard to learn all the students in a
Absolutely.
big class.
Absolutely, and I will fully admit I am the absolute worst at names. If you told me your name, it would be out of my head the second that you said it. That's part of my brain processing. It just doesn't record that in the same way. But I remember people's faces. So I'll see you and I'll be like, hey, you know, and I may never call you by name because I may not know it, and I may have let it go too long where it's now awkward for me to say. But I'd like to think that at least if I was being intentional and I was going to send a student an email to make sure to tell them not to come to class, this is a UT school. I think most of us have PeopleSoft. We have pictures. You could log on and look up the picture of that student to make sure that you had the right
You
person.
see, I call on people when they raise their hand, I call them by name. That's why I
That's
try to learn
awesome.
their names. But, you know, I always have some people I just can't get right.
No,
And I try to figure out, why can't I get these people
I don't
right?
think, I mean, in general, I don't think that's necessarily associated with bias. Why you can't remember which one's Ben, and I've already forgotten what you said the other one's name was?
Chance.
They're the two white boys, men who sit in the corner by each other, and they're always together, so they're associated together. So their names are associated collectively and not individually.
I mean, the most interesting thing about this third bullet is the phrase disrespectful behavior. This professor views this as disrespectful. And, you know, so that's an issue that the professor has with themselves.
But is that a problem? Because, you know, you go by your personal values, and I have many cultural problems sometimes, because the way that I grew up, if your teacher says your question's wrong, you lower your head and say, yes, sir, I'm sorry, or, you know, and here, but why is not wrong? You know, they keep going on and on and on. It's a cultural thing that you need to deal with. And to me, what she's doing on the syllabus, she's trying to learn from what happened. So she's trying to raise the bar, that her expectations, I'd like you to respect, excuse me, in a certain way. So I don't really understand why they complained on the syllabus. It may be a little bit out there, but what she's trying to do is, here's what I expect from you. They've raised expectations.
And I think that's a really fair assessment. And I think if she had done that the prior semester, she may not have ended up in the place that she ended up in. But I think this also shows the power of your peers to influence the university environment, both positively and negatively, depending upon the situation. This is seen as a very culturally insensitive situation. Whether or not she's actually biased or not, we have at least some evidence that she didn't do this for any of the other students that she told multiple times not to put their feet on the chairs. She probably did learn some classroom management skills of if that keeps being a problem that you have to stop class all the time, then maybe you needed to address it differently at the beginning and send people send them all away for the day, like when it happens. If you do that across the board, eventually your students are either gonna quit doing it, or your class enrollment's gonna go down to 0. And I think as long as you do that fairly, it's okay. So now we've kind of gotten impacts when you're a student, both K through 12 and in higher ed. That impact just keeps continuing in your career progression. This study is actually older, but it's very similar to the one that I gave you with the lab managers. Identical resumes, different names, a white sounding name, a black sounding name, a male sounding name, a female sounding name. Everyone, regardless of their particular identity, views the white sounding names more favorably than the female names or the black names. It's constant. It's part of our culture and the things that we pick up and the associations that we make. That's the explanation, because there is no other when you are looking at the exact same resume and the exact same CV, and the only thing different is the person's name. And then it goes on to ask for a letter of recommendation, for instance. Women are much more likely to be described as a team player, nurturing, dependable. Men are going to be brilliant and confident and a rock star. And there is other research on letters of recommendation, particularly as it relates to like the tenure and promotion process. And they even quote from some of the letters and the things that they say about women, and it's about personality and being caring and nurturing and dependable, and the men are all brilliant and like they're the best thing since sliced bread. The research is great, like almost devoid of that emotion. And when we're doing job performance type things, we're looking at the work performance and not the person. Funding, something near and dear to all your heart, right? Black PhD scientists were far less likely to receive grant funding about a research idea than their white scientists with similar institution and similar records. There was a smaller gap found for Asians, and when you're including Asians that are only US citizens, the gap disappears entirely. Scholarship. Women receive lower scores for the same level of scientific productivity, and you need 2.5 times the publications than men to achieve the same level of success. Contribution. Women are disproportionately perform the experimental work labor involving in producing science. Men are much more likely to be credited for the analyzing data, the ideas. Teaching evaluation. So now, if you actually make it an employment in a university setting as a faculty member, your students also have unconscious bias, and they're going to demonstrate that towards you as well. There's significant gender bias in teaching evaluations. Again, identical professors, different name, male, female, identical evaluations, even when it includes objective type information like how fast it took them to return assignments. And it continues. Rate my professor. Lovely sight, isn't it? The frequency of the word brilliant and genius is much more likely to be found for white male professors than it is for women or African Americans. Now, I won't say what I was going to say about rate my professor. Talent. So women are not underrepresented, are not only represented in STEM fields, they are well represented in some fields such as biological sciences, and underrepresented in fields like philosophy and economics. Across the academic spectrum, women and minorities are underrepresented in fields where raw innate talent and brilliance are highly valued because they're not seen as having those particular attributes. Success. So when a woman is successful in a job that's more stereotypically male, for instance, they are seen as aggressive and hard to get along with. And inverse is also true when men are in more stereotypically female-like roles, such as nurses. They're seen as wimpy and less deserving of respect. And then I think I would be remiss not to talk somewhat about intersectionality. So we all have multiple identities. Where those things cross, and if you have more than one of being in an underrepresented group, you're going to have bias coming from multiple different angles. So for instance, Latinos who behave assertively are emotional or angry. Black women who behave assertively risk being perceived as the angry black woman. Almost half of Latina and Black female scientists have been mistaken for administrative support, including janitors. The stereotype of Asian women of being good at math is usually a positive attribute with students, but not with colleagues. With colleagues, they get more backlash when they face masculine-like traits such as being assertive and engaging in self-promotion. I have not been paying attention to the time. Okay. Alright, so just stop me when I run out. So now we're going to move to some of the things that you can do to try to create a more inclusive background. And before we get there, I won't read all of these, I'll just skim through some of them. But these are biased assumptions that you may have as an instructor. And it's based on those unconscious associations that you have that you're not aware of. You might assume students know how to ask for help, but students who are actually more at risk for struggling are less likely to ask for help. You might assume students from certain backgrounds or social groups have different intellectual abilities or ambitions. Students who speak with certain accents might be perceived to be poor writers. Students with substandard writing abilities might be perceived to have less intellectual capabilities. Students affiliated with particular group identity may be treated as experts on a subject. That's not a good practice, just a caveat. So if you have a particular student who's Black or African American and you're talking about a related topic, don't call on that student to speak for the entire group. Instructors may assume that students only respond well to characters who demographically resemble them. They may be expected to have certain participation styles, such as women are usually expected to be quieter, meek, etc. Men are usually seen as more assertive, aggressive. People don't conform to what your assumptions are. Okay. So some methods of making your classroom more inclusive. Provide support for your students, be available, and kind of set that out up front. When are your office hours? When are you available? Make habits where you respond to emails. They don't have to be like the second the person sends them, but on a regular basis, you're staying engaged with the students. If the students are reaching out to you, you should engage back with them. Consider teaching and learning frameworks. Are there different ways to offer your course content? Can you have some things that are visual, some things that are written? How can you incorporate a mix so you hit a broad range of learning styles? Examine your own implicit biases. Awareness really is kind of the first step for mitigating bias, and that starts with your own internal self-work to think about and consider interactions that you've had, what assumptions you might be making about people before you have any experience with them. Maintain awareness of classroom diversity as a way to kind of test your bias. Are you treating all students equally? Incorporate diversity into the curriculum where it's possible to do so. Cultivate an inclusive environment, and this goes back to kind of your point. Students need to be comfortable in the classroom space in order to want to participate and be fully engaged. And so some of the things that you can do is up front, day one, on your syllabus, outline your expectations for behavior. The positive attributes, in addition to the potentially negative ones like putting your feet up on chairs or whatever the particular expectation that you may have, and really speak to that as this is how we're going to treat each other in this class. We're going to be respectful. If someone's talking, we're going to listen to them talk, and then we're going to respond. If you disagree with their idea, that's okay. We don't make personal attacks against each other. We should be able to have debates about ideas that are not about our individual persons. I think I just covered that first one. Consider universal design principles. That's making your classes as accessible as possible. That's very much geared towards students with disabilities, but it's really applicable across the board. The more accessible the course material you offer, the less need for students to have accommodations. If your course book is already in 4 different formats, including, large print, online, whatever, that's the textbook you pick, you've already saved half the battle of having a person with maybe limited vision or low vision from having to work with the Student Accessibility Office to get alternate text formats, for instance. Solicit student feedback. So this particular suggestion was use online surveys to collect from students at the beginning what their engagement and experience is with the course material before they got here. One of the specific examples that I read that was specific to math in particular was on your first day of class, have your students write a very short 1-2 page reflective type essay of what's their interest in math, what's their exposure to math, why are they in these fields. That's going to give you information about the students, and you can see where they're at, how engaged they are, how interested they are, and that keep getting feedback from them, midterm evaluations, continue that engagement throughout the entire semester. And then lastly, this one kind of goes back to your own awareness. Review the literature. You guys are all researchers, very highly specialized things that I would not understand most likely. But how often do you actually do research on the pedagogy in your field about how to teach your course content? Last one of this type of things, but I thought it was really good. So this was from a blogger who defines tone policing as when marginalized people speak up about our struggles and when people from more dominant groups focus on not what we said, but how we said it. And I think that comes up a lot because the way you say things does sometimes convey a different message than what you mean. But if that argument only comes into play when it's someone of color saying it, does it matter how they say it? As long as it's not rude, disrespectful, if it's not in the cadence that you would expect, the tone you would expect, the volume you would expect, their points are just as valid, regardless of if they're speaking the way you speak or not. So teaching resources for math, this is an association that has information about various pedagogical practices in undergraduate mathematics education, a whole list of journals where you can look up articles on pedagogy. And last from the headlines, this would be an example of how not to increase diversity in your course materials. So a professor at Minnesota College on a chemistry exam asked students to calculate the lethal dose of hydrogen cyanide and mentioned that that's the gas the Nazis used in the gas chambers. Obviously that made news. The president released a statement and they reviewed the last 10 exams from this professor and found one in the previous year that had made a reference to the Ku Klux Klan. The professor went on leave, and he did issue an apology, which basically, clearly I didn't know what I was doing, I'm sorry that I offended you. He may have been meaning to be funny, and I'm really big on pop culture type references and things to make connections in other ways that would hit your students or what they're interested in, what TV shows they're watching, what books they're reading, those types of things. I don't know that someone had to be told that this would be insensitive. This isn't an unconscious bias. This is the choice that, oh, I think that's funny and they won't care, or something else. I don't really know. This is my way of kind of checking yourself. Make assumptions about what you're doing. If you're describing a person or situation and you're concerned that you might be biased, or even if you're not, am I being fair? Change the person. Is what you're saying about them or what your evaluation, does it make sense? If it starts to sound ridiculous, like I would never say that about a man, but I'm saying it about this female candidate or student, for instance, then you might want to rethink what you're doing. And this was from a TED Talk in particular, but how often do people describe men as fragile, emotional, helpful, sure maybe, supportive, sure maybe. I think the positive attributes, the women, seem less shocking because those do happen, but when you look at these at the bottom in particular, I'm like, you typically would not say that about a man. So why are why are those the things that you're describing when you're looking at the and this was like evaluations for promotions by an HR manager who was a woman and learned that she had a bias towards women because that was what her TED Talk was about. Some really quick tips about respectful communication. Check your own assumptions. Use person-first language. So it's a person with a disability, not a disabled person. Consider your audience. Who are you talking to? Your undergraduate students, your graduate students, your colleagues. Have a conversation with someone instead of at someone. Confirm that you understand what people are saying. If they're saying something, be like, let me repeat back what I heard to make sure that I got, you check in to make sure that you're following along. Talk to your peers and colleagues, and communicate disagreements respectfully. These are some tips from a program that I believe is actually called Ouch, That Stereotype Hurts. When you're interacting with anyone, you start by assuming good intent. For the most part, people are not trying to offend you or make you mad or treat you differently. And if you start from that frame of reference, it gives them a little grace if they say something that might be insensitive. And it gives you a little grace and breathing room to not immediately react. And if you're not sure what they're saying, or they're saying something that's really offensive, ask them a question. Do you mean? And then repeat what they say and try to get clarification. Interrupt them or redirect them back to an appropriate topic if it's someone who's really going off the rails. Broaden it to universal behavior. So if they're saying all, fill in the blank, are, whatever the attribute is. Say, oh, I did that wrong. Let me skip that to make that individual. If someone is saying all, fill in the blank, are, we'll say, I don't think that's true. I think lots of people are like that. That would be broadening it widely. And the reverse. And then the last one, say ouch, is if someone says something really offensive, literally say ouch. All women are stupid. Ouch. Like, that's cold. Like, that puts them on notice that what they've said is not appropriate. Questions? No questions. Well, thank you all for letting me talk to you today.
I just want to make one comment about 10 slides back. You had a list of literature. The first one was a MAA publication. It's a great publication specifically about math pedagogy. Read it if you get a chance. It's really long, but read a bit of it. It's really good.
And I think they're going to send out the slides later, so it'll have the links and stuff for anything that you might be interested in. And somewhere there might be an evaluation that I think you have to take, to satisfy the government for the money.
So what part of the university, I see the institutional equity, where are you under? I mean, what part, are you under the provost office, or?
Oh, no, that institutional equity, Title IX and compliance are a separate office. We're located in Spend, and so I'm the director of institutional equity, and then there are people who do just Title IX. I like to describe institutional equity as everything else. So Title IX is one thing, every other civil rights law requirement is institutional equity and EEO, so that's what I do.
Any other question or comment? Yes, please.
I was wondering what inter-rated grading was. It was one of the suggestions on
I'm
the
sorry?
slides. Inter-rated grading?
opting out of this and it's maybe won't go back. Oh, it did. If I don't have it in there, I can send it all to you later, because these all
There it
came
is.
from.
Inter-rater, sorry, inter-rater.
Okay. So, midterm, I'm sorry, I can't hear.
No, I was just wondering what it was. I didn't understand. Inter-rater grading, second line from the bottom.
Okay.
Inter-rater grading.
Oh, gotcha. I don't know the answer to that question, but I can find that out. And then maybe where I was so confused, I'm like, I'm not sure what you're saying. But these resources all came from Yale, and they were the best ones that I found that were specific to kind of how to walk the line between, both your scholarship and the topic that you're teaching, but do it inclusively. I don't think it matters what the topic is. There are ways to kind of.
Probably means the second party also grading in second rater, inter-rater, between two raters.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, let's thank. Let me just